In this episode of Windev, I'll be covering the development of Windows NT 3.1, 3.5, and 3.51, being released on the 27th of July 1993, the 21st of September 1994, and the 30th of May 1995, respectively. Let's begin. Windows NT started in 1988 as a portable 32-bit version of IBM and, at the time, Microsoft's OS/2. This effort was appropriately named Portable OS/2, later NT OS/2, featuring support for the 16 and 32-bit OS/2 APIs, alongside implementing the POSIX standard, with a release slated for the early 90s as OS/2 3.0. This project was initially developed for Intel's i860 processor, codenamed N10, which is where the NT name initially came from. The new technology moniker came after in a, quote, rare spurt of product marketing by the original NT team members. After the i860 fell harder than a hard drive in Linus Sebastian's hands, they decided to port the system to the i386 and MIPS architectures. In 1990, after the deal between IBM and Microsoft fell through, they decided to make Windows the main environment for NT, as opposed to OS/2, with the actual OS/2 3 being released as OS/2 Warp 3 in 1994. Shortly after, the system was renamed Advanced Windows and then Windows NT. This is where we get to the earliest build of Windows NT that we have our hands on, build 196, being compiled on the 17th of September, 1991. Oddly, the CD for this build is an early version of Windows 3.1's logo, alongside the final version of 3.0 and 1.0's. Running setup from DOS, you can see that, just like the first build of Windows 1.0 and 3.0, the setup is merely just a batch file that copies files to the correct installation folders. Once setup is finished, you may notice that the system has copied the boot files to non-contiguous blocks. The only known way to fix this is to install this build using MS-DOS 6 and using the defrag utility. Once you reboot the system, it'll show a screen asking which you want to boot from between Windows and DOS. On the boot screen, the system was referred to as NT386, with a copyright date of 1990 and version 1.9 of the PDK bootloader. Going to the desktop, and hoping to God this build doesn't hang every 5 seconds, we can see that the system is referred to here as NT 32-bit Windows, and that it was compiled by the NT x86 build user. The About dialog refers to the system as version, Command Prompt calls it Windows NT 3.2, and Print Manager calls it NT Windows. Some of the applications seen in this build include Winbez, internally called Bogus and Kent's Window Test application, the Performance Meter, which monitors the performance of the system as the name implies, PlaySound, which plays sound files including the 26 sample sounds included in the system, which come from Windows 3.0 with multimedia extensions, Multithread, which is a test application for executing multiple threads in the same application, Cursor, an application for testing graphics selection and special mouse pointers, GDI Demo, an application for testing the functionality of the Graphics Device Interface, or GDI, Menu, which tests context menus and menu bars, and Simple, which simply prints Win32, it's happening! This build also includes Minesweeper under its preliminary name, WinMine, and Solitaire. Solitaire has a debug option in its context menu, although the entry's name is blank, with such functions as Force Win, which automatically wins the ongoing game, Assert Failure, which forces an assertion failure to appear, and Configure for Screenshots, which resets the ongoing game. All in all, this build is clearly very early in Windows NT's development, and thus isn't very stable. For example, if you try to view the About box in Minesweeper, the system crashes. Pressing the print screen key will also crash the system, files in File Manager sometimes fail to show up, and the keyboard is sometimes completely unresponsive. Moving on to build 297, compiled on the 28th of June 1992, we can see that this build has an all-new setup similar to that of Windows 3.1. One notable change is that the files are now copied to the CWinNT directory as opposed to CNT. Rebooting from setup, we can see that the boot screen now has a background color of blue as opposed to gray like in 196, and that the system now identifies itself as Windows NT Preliminary Release for Developers. This is reflected further by the new default wallpaper, prelim.bitmap, which also identifies the system as such. This build also adds system sounds, which are the same as the ones from Windows 3.1, alongside adding log-on and log-off sounds. The development sample apps from build 196 have been removed, with the addition of several new apps, including Performance Monitor, which, while this program was in build 196, now has a GUI to go along with it, Disk Manager and Event Viewer, which are still in Windows to this day, and Tape Backup, which, as the name implies, allows you to back up your data to cassette tape. Alongside these, several applications from Windows 3.1 have been added, such as Media Player, Sound Recorder, Card File, Paintbrush, and FreeCell, adding one new application, the CD Player. This build has the ability to shut the system down via Windows, as opposed to just logging off like in build 196. As we reach the official March 1993 beta, build 404, compiled on the 6th of March 1993, we're just 4 months away from the final build, so we're starting to see fewer and fewer changes take effect. Here are some of the changes that we do see in this build. One of the first things that we can see is that this build introduces NT Detect, which detects the machine's hardware before starting the boot process. Going to the boot screen, we can see that it's looking a bit closer to the final build, with the system identifying itself as March Beta 1993. Going to the desktop, we can now see that the default background color has been changed from gray to a teal color, the default color scheme has been changed to the one seen in the final build, and the default wallpaper has been changed to read Beta March 1993. The title bar of the Program Manager now shows the computer's name as well as the name of the current user. Some of the new applications in this build include Mail and Schedule Plus, which come from Windows for Workgroups, Chat, an application for communicating with other computers, given they're both of modems, and an emulator for the IBM 3270 printer terminal, which wouldn't make it into the final build. That's mostly it for major changes in these builds. Some other changes in later builds, including the icons and the control panel being changed to the ones from the final build, which came in build 438, and a smaller font being used for the boot screen and the blue screen of death, which came in build 475, before we get to the final build of Windows NT 3.1, build 511, being compiled on the 24th of July, 1993. Changes in this build compared to others are some new billboards during setup, and the removal of the ability to boot from a previously installed operating system during the boot process, which in some cases would appear even if there was no previously installed operating system. In September, an updated version of NT 3.1, build 528, would be released, being the basis for every service pack and concept introduced in NT 3.1, with 3 being released in 1993 and 94. Windows NT 3.1 was released on the 27th of July, 1993, with support ending on the 31st of December 2000. In 1994, Windows NT 3.5, codenamed Daytona, would start development, with build 612 being compiled on the 15th of April. One of the first things that we can see in this build is that the setup has been updated to display a warning about some updates made to the FAT and NTFS file systems, rendering older builds unable to upgrade. The boot menu now has an option to boot using standard VGA graphics in case there's a problem with the existing graphics drivers. The boot screen has been updated to the style we'd see until NT 4.0, now showing how many processors are in the system. Going to the desktop, we can see that the default wallpaper has been changed to show the Windows flag inside of a flag, reading Windows NT version 3.5 Beta. This build introduces the WinBug bug reporting utility, which allows the user to report bugs they encounter in the system and save them to a disk, alongside a new control panel applet, which allows the user to change the screen resolution, color depth, font size, refresh rate, etc. This build also includes a new way of running setup from within Windows, WinNT32.exe, which seems to be nothing more than a GUI for the existing WinNT setup procedure in this build. Later builds don't seem to introduce too many features, besides adding the /B switch for WinNT to install the system without needing floppy disks, and adding the workstation name in build 683. This is where we get to the final build of Windows NT 3.5, build 807, released on the 21st of September, 1994, introducing new default wallpapers for the server and workstation variants, featuring a 3-dimensional Windows flag for workstation and an all-new logo for server. Support for Windows NT 3.5 ended on the 31st of December, 2001. Shortly after NT 3.5 was released, NT 3.51 would start development, with build 854 being compiled on the 19th of November, 1994. This build contains 2 features that wouldn't make it into the final build, including the Chicago Shell and the Object File System, or OFS. The former is, as the name implies, the shell from Chicago, or Windows 95, intended for developers to test their applications under a new shell. This would later be released as a standalone product in May 1995 under the name New Shell. Installing this normally should work, but on the machine I use, the system just crashes on startup after installing. The latter feature, OFS, was a file system meant to be seen in another project, codenamed Cairo, which never saw the light of day, although the concept did make its way into early beta versions of Windows codenamed Longhorn as WinFS, which was ultimately scrapped in 2006. Alongside those, this build introduces a new version of Media Player and some customization options for the command prompt. Other than that, this build and the builds that would follow don't introduce too much, besides the final default wallpaper and the final setup background in build 1002. The final build is numbered build 1057. Windows NT 3.51 would be released on the 30th of May 1995 and would end support on the 31st of December 2001 for the workstation variant and the 30th of September 2002 for the server variant.